How do I sound? Clothes make the man. Don't judge a book by its cover. Clothes don't make the man. Fine feathers make fine birds. You can't judge a man by his mistakes. What you see is what you get. Hardly a surprise that bumper sticker philosophy has a bit of a split personality on the topic of prejudging. Of course, as is often the case with bumper sticker philosophy, both points of view have their truth. Like a lot of things in the real world, there's kind of a wide and fuzzy line dividing when an attribute is useful from when it is harmful, like fearlessness. Too little and you don't do anything. Too much and you live a short life. Prejudging is like that. Too much and you miss a lot of opportunities. Don't do it at all and it's hard to function. Some people espouse the attitude that we should never prejudge based on appearance. Believe it or not, there are some people who actually believe they do not. Both attitudes are, well, sorry, ridiculous. Of course we need to, and of course we do. All the time, every day, over and over. We judge books by their covers, or some variation of that, because we need to. For one thing, to stick to the book metaphor, you can't read the whole book just to decide if you want to read the book. People are sort of like a very thick book. They're complicated and subtle. Interactions between people just compound that complication. You can't get to know the real person before you must decide if and how you're going to interact with them. When people talk about prejudging other people, they often use the word prejudice, a word that when one delves into the actual meaning is very difficult to find what is different about the word prejudice from prejudgment. But in common usage, prejudice is applied when the judgment is made on an attribute that the speaker considers unjust. Some criteria is commonly considered unjust, such as having nappy hair. Some criteria would be considered reasonable by just about everyone but the speaker, as in, you're just prejudiced against me because I'm a rude, aggressive nuisance. Insert any word for nuisance that you like. I'm just not going to use the word prejudice due to its inconsistent yet strong negative connotations and stick to the more neutral word prejudgment, even though, as I said, they do mean the same thing. If you remove the judgment of good or bad from the reasons, they both mean that you made a judgment you did not have enough information to make. The fact is, the very idea that you shouldn't judge someone by how they look is quite new. It's one of the reasons why people have historically cared a great deal about what clothes you wear. In medieval times, wearing clothes that suggested a different profession than you were actually engaged in, or a gender other than your parts suggested, or a social class you were not born into, or a religion you didn't follow, or that you had some social status that you don't, was considered donning a disguise, highly suspect, and often actually illegal. Sumptuary laws were common. These were laws that governed what people could wear. We're not talking about a restaurant dress code here, but actual laws that could get you fined, arrested, imprisoned, and in some cases, actually executed. There were those that put limits on what the wealthy could wear in order to reduce social tension from conspicuous consumption. those that restricted the newly wealthy from mimicking the born nobility, and those that demanded that your clothes accurately represented your status and place in society. These last two were intended to reduce deception. Clothes advertise who you are. And truth in advertising was expected, nay, demanded. This allows people to know you on meeting and make appropriate decisions on how to interact with you. Nobility were treated differently than commoners. Women were treated different than men. Those of means treated differently than those without. Members of the clergy different than laymen. Nowadays, there's almost no laws concerning clothing other than an expectation that you keep your private bits covered and you don't pretend you're a cop. In theory, at least, we believe that all people are legally equal, and we both are expected to treat others equally and expect to be treated by others in a fair and consistent way, regardless of what clothes we wear or how we look in general. Of course, we don't do this. Can't do this. I treat my sister different than any other person. My second ex-husband would get a uniquely unfriendly reaction. I've been known to hand my boyfriend cash on request. But more relevant to this discussion, I treat different groups differently. Groups of individuals I know, of course, get preferential standing as a group, such as anyone from this church or the Gridley Sew Girls. I trust someone actively doing a job for me more than the average stranger, such as a cashier or the PG&E guy or a fireman. This is the basis of prejudgment, putting people into a group that you already have some knowledge of and using the attributes attributed to that group to make judgments about the person you just put in it. While most people think of prejudgment as making assumptions about a person based on their skin color, gender, age, or accent, which we do, we actually draw clues about a person from a long list of attributes, a list that changes with the judging person, the situation, the person being judged, and many other things. A list that includes the situation you're meeting in, the clothes they wear and how they wear them, their hair, their cleanliness, the way they walk, talk, and move, what kind of expressions do they wear, how much attention are they paying. I could go on all day, and I'm sure if you think about it, you would find a personal list that you use to first judge a person. But let me warn you, you will have to think about it a lot because you really don't think about it at all when you're doing it. We start making judgments about a person as soon as they come into our awareness. The first look, the first sounds, the first word. If they interact with us, spend time around us, we constantly update our file. We start adjusting our opinion as soon as we get to know their politics, religious opinion, profession, family life, charity, ambition, well, and on. We generally start with a judgment on how they look because that's what we encounter first. If the situation was such that the interaction takes place without a visual, then we judge first on whatever it is we encounter first. And like we might be surprised to find out that the scruffy garden guy next door has a PhD in finance, when we see someone that we've gotten to know without seeing them, we might find that we are surprised by how they look. This is because in both cases, in all cases, when we first interact with someone, we're making a whole slew of important decisions we don't have enough information to make. And how we are doing that is we are using whatever data we are getting to categorize the person. Our brain really, really likes categories. It is incredibly fast and adept at categorizing. And most of that categorization happens outside of our conscious awareness. And we use this categorization to keep track of an incredibly complex world. The human brain does have an unreal amount of processing power and storage, but we still cannot deal with the world keeping each item and event we encounter in its own file. If the person we're dealing with gets put into a category based on some data point in early meeting, and we find that that person is not part of that category, we often find ourselves with a feeling of surprise. A company I worked for soon after college had a sister division in Nevada. The company had a dedicated phone line just so the computers could talk to each other. I regularly traded messages with the engineering department at the other division. A combination of my name, Suli, a tendency to phrase things in very polite ways when I'm writing, and the fact that I was an engineer combined to give the person I usually talk to a picture of me as a small, quiet Oriental lady. An image of me never occurred to her to share. One day, the company had cause to send me to the Nevada plant. The visible surprise on her face when her small, quiet Oriental lady was suddenly replaced in her brain by a tall, loud Gale was outstanding. We had a great laugh over lunch discussing our pre-meeting expectations. But the reality is we put everything into categories and our brain does not question that category much, and we do not recognize that we are doing it usually until there's a conflict and something doesn't fit into the category we put it in. A conflict our brain usually solves by recategorizing. Such conflicts happen in our lives with great regularity. One of the problems with making judgments without enough data to make them is that errors in categorization are common. Because these errors can result in an unfair judgment of a person that causes some unfavorable thing to happen to them, people often assert that any prejudgment of other humans is wrong, and we shouldn't ever do it. But what they really mean is that we should have some prudence and an open mind attached to our prejudgment. Since you can't deal on first meeting with each person as appropriate for the real them because you don't know the real them. And the only other way to not prejudge and treat it, the only other way to not prejudge is to treat everyone the same on meeting and then adjust as you actually have enough data. But it really doesn't take much thinking about it to realize that reacting to each person you meet exactly the same and only adjusting as you get to know the real person is simply not practical. I think most people would agree, for instance, that trusting everyone completely on first meeting is probably dangerous. But if you reject any kind of prejudgment and choose some safe, common way to treat everyone, that leaves your only safe option to be to never trust anyone until they prove themselves trustworthy. And if you've ever known a person who has a really, really hard time trusting anyone, you know that that's an inefficient and difficult way to deal with humans. Which means that in a practical sense, when you're prejudging someone, you're not deciding if they're not trustworthy. You're deciding to what extent you're going to trust this person even though you don't really know them. And your decision about how much you will trust this person on meeting will be dependent on what categories your subconscious decided to put that person in. Categories you are unlikely to be aware of unless you stop and actually think about it. Anthony Grimwald, one of the people who developed a test for implicit bias, began that journey because of noticing himself assume that a black man walking down the street at night might attack the white woman waiting alone at the bus stop. He didn't. This despite the fact that consciously, Anthony felt that all humans are equal and that racial bias is unjust. Even understanding how his test worked, he was surprised to find that when he took it, it did in fact show a strong pro-white bias. Anthony is white. The test, in fact, shows that 70 to 80% of people have an implicit bias toward their own race. It also showed that more than half of people have implicit biases that follow common stereotypes. There's a TV show called What Would You Do?, which is a candid camera type thing where they set up moral dilemmas to see how people might react. In one, they had a series of different people in a park appearing to be trying to steal a bicycle. Between two young men, similarly dressed, people were twice as likely to call the cops on the black kid than the white kid before stopping to ask him what was going on. And men would stop and help the pretty young white girl in skimpy clothes, even with their wife watching and the girl implying heavily that she was, in fact, stealing the bicycle. And in many cases, especially those, people were clearly confused to realize how they were reacting. Their brain was automatically categorizing what they were seeing. Of course, people do not like being judged to be someone they're not, based on criteria they were born with and cannot help, such as the type of hair they have as opposed to what style it's in, or the color of their skin or their accent. I do agree with that sentiment, but like it or not, it's not actually a realistic expectation. When people see their biases, even when people see their biases, removing them is not so easy of a task. Just look at Anthony Grimwald. He thought of himself as a person who didn't have a racial bias. He thought it was wrong to judge people on race. He wanted to become a person without those biases. But decades after he started the study of implicit biases, he will still freely admit that many of his biases persist. One of the things that a young brain is doing is creating its categorization system. And one of the things about brain wiring that happened when you were a kid is that it's very difficult to change. Most often, we will make a new category out of conflicting information. For instance, a person who believes that young men are foolish will put the prudent and sensible young man who just started to work with him over there in engineers and not put him in young men, or change his view of the category young men. What this means is that deciding to not be prejudiced in your prejudgment by not using criteria that you view as unjust only works if you already don't use them. If you do use them, it is much, much more effective to learn to be aware of your judgment criteria and second guess it a little, sort of like this. I know a woman who in the last few years discovered that she had developed a discomfort bordering on fear of large black women. This happened because through most of her life, though her interactions with large black women had been good, they were infrequent, casual, and short-lived. But at one point, she ended up with a neighbor who was large, black, and crazy. At first, it seemed like they would be friends as the woman was intelligent and interesting. But one day she asked for a ride to New York, was turned down, and it was war. When my friend first called the local police over being harassed, they all already knew her. Her family agreed she was nuts. The whole neighborhood had stories about her. Her harassment included threatening email and phone calls, garbage tossed over the fence, bright lights shining in the window, creepy dolls hanging in the yard, and threats of lawsuits and publications of all the wrongs that had been committed. This continued until it was noticed that the woman was no longer in her house. Rumors flew that she was 1, in prison, or 2, in an insane asylum. After a year got by, my friend began to calm down and would not be so afraid. But then she noticed her unease, even fear, as soon as a large black woman came into her view. She did not feel at all good about her reaction. She knew it was unfair. So now, every time she encounters a large Black woman, she stops her mind and makes it a point to actually look at the woman and point out to herself that she's not the neighbor. And if not totally change her feelings, at least change her actions and attitude. She knew she was being unjust. And the thing about unjust, unfair, or overly broad judgments is that it's a self-punishing system. Being unfair, pretty much by definition, means that your error rate is going to be higher. And rejecting somebody who could have been a true friend or even just a good plumber will be to your loss. The other thing you can do, besides making it a point to second guess your own judgment, which honestly is good advice in all aspects of your life, is to decide what criteria you think is both fair and useful and focus on that. One of the reasons prejudging based on clothes is so useful is that we choose our clothes. Most people are well aware that we are judged on how we look, and so we advertise who we are or who we want you to treat us like. We do that with our hairstyles, clothes, makeup, expressions, jewelry, body art. For people who get to know us better, we'll advertise with our house, our car. Oh, you may say, I don't advertise with my car. I just have the most practical car option available. True that. You didn't buy your car to advertise, but it does advertise. It says, I'm the kind of person whose number one criteria for a car is that it makes sense in my life. I've heard people complain that they were judged on their clothes or their body art. But if you don't think you align with the message your clothes give, why not wear other clothes? Or if you do think you align with your clothes, but you don't think people should judge you the way that they do, well, what can I say? People get to not like you. I consider someday shaving my hair off. It's really thin. It keeps falling out. I'm tired of picking hair up off my chairs. It tangles easily. I don't want to have to go have it cut by a professional every few weeks, and I don't want to have to style it so it's not just a few wispy gray hairs stuck to my head. Zzzt. The problem is that a shaved head on a woman indicates a personality that's not at all what I feel I identify with or want to be treated like at this point in my life. It's true, we all want to be judged fairly by others. But what we mean by fair is they judge me as good as I think I am. Well, not everyone's going to agree, and guess what? Not every criteria they use is going to be fair. We all want to judge fairly too, but the reality is that this is an impossible dream of perfection not evident in humans. But being more fair is to our advantage. If we could actually know every person's true nature on first contact, it would be great, not just for them, but for ourselves too. But that's not something we just decide to do. It's something we work toward, which means more than anything else, awareness, prudence, and an open mind. Blessed be.
Thank you, Suli. That was absolutely wonderful.